can begin. And I
Yes.
want to begin by asking about your youth and maybe childhood as well. How did you decide to go into Yiddish studies, and what was the story behind this?
Yes. I was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1956. My father, Menke Katz, a Yiddish poet, he was then 50 years old, he brought me up entirely in Yiddish and in Litvish Yiddish. So he created for me the imaginary world of his three shtetlalach, his three towns that the family had lived in all those hundreds of years. Today in Lithuania it's Vincian, or Švenčionis, and Michalishik and Svir today in Belarus. So the other Yiddish writers in New York did not usually speak Yiddish to their children. They thought of themselves as the Mohicans. But my father brought me up to love Yiddish and to love our Litvak heritage, and when necessary, to fight for both. Because both were small, very small concerns in America, an America that was so interested in commercial and career success. It sounded crazy. I remember when I was growing up, people saying to him, don't you want him to be a doctor or a lawyer, or if he's a complete idiot, at least an accountant? What is this, Yiddish and Lita and Shtetl and poet? So I grew up Then I went to religious Hebrew schools in Brooklyn. We were not personally observant in the family, but we were very traditional. And when I went to university, I majored in Yiddish. But before university, something happened that changed my life. I was a student in a American Hebrew Zionist day school, very famous school, Yeshiva of Flatbush, very good school. But absolutely no Yiddish, nothing. When a Yiddish writer like Shalom Aleichem was taught, it was taught in Hebrew translation with no mention that it's a translation. So when I was in my second year, the Americans call it the sophomore year, I was 15 years old, I made a petition for the introduction of Yiddish as an element, as a voluntary subject, an option in the final year. And there was a verbally violent reaction from the administrators and teachers. What? We have Israel, we have Hebrew, what kind of Yiddish? Yiddish is the language of the ghetto, of the Jews who went to the slaughter. We have now the new Jew, the Jews fighting for his country. And our reply was, it's not a contradiction. This is our own heritage. And you know, about 90% of the children came from East European Jewish backgrounds, Lithuania, Ukraine, Poland, but they were not taught to respect the language, culture, or literature of their own parents. Now, it is not the fault of the Hebraists that the Yiddishists failed to produce a new generation in America. So that changed my life. When I saw that there are so many forces that do not want Yiddish to live, I decided that the life of Yiddish would be very important in my future life. But when I got to Columbia University at the age of 18, I began to specialize on the academic side, linguistics, the history of Yiddish. So my focus became the origin of Yiddish 1,000 years ago, and the biggest surprise for me was I was finding evidence that all Yiddish dialects that we know about come from some very similar proto-language that they evolved from, and that the Hebrew and Aramaic elements in Yiddish were there from the beginning, in my view, that they were not added later to some kind of German. And I researched, I wrote papers. I didn't like New York. It was very violent then. I did my third year of the 4, Americans call it the junior year abroad, in London, fell in love with London and with the British Museum Library that had a fantastic collection of old Yiddish. So after my BA, I more or less left America, more or less for good, and I settled in London to do my doctorate at University College on my favorite topic, the origins of the Hebrew and Aramaic component in Yiddish. The day I turned up in London in 1978, they were looking for a teacher of Yiddish for 1 hour a week in Oxford Elementary. So I said, yes, I'm here. And I worked there for 18 years. So for 18 years, I built a program in Yiddish studies at Oxford University. It went from that 1 hour to half a job to a full job. In the early 80s, I started the Oxford Yiddish summer course, a 1-month intensive summer course that I later moved to Vilnius in 1998. And I would say the Oxford years were very good and productive. The program fell apart in the mid-90s because of a dispute between two donors. It had never been an endowed program. It was always looking for support each year. So I left and I got a job at Yale University in America, where I spent 1 year, and may my friends there forgive me. It was the most boring year of my life, living in New Haven. And my mother, who is 97 years old, still does not forgive me that at the end of the year I decided to move to Vilnius and not to accept their offer of 10 years there, and I'll come to that. From 1990, I had been visiting Lithuania. So I'll come to that in a moment. So in Vilnius, I came in 1999, and my job was to start the Center for Stateless Cultures at Vilnius University. That was Roma and Old Believers and Tatar and Karaims and Yiddish. 5 cultures for which Vilna was the center for many hundreds of years. 5 cultures that never wanted a state. So that's very different from the peoples on the planet who have a state or it's been taken away, it's been invaded, they've been expelled. These are stateless cultures in principle. And then after a few years, I founded the Vilnius Yiddish Institute in 2001. So in general, I would say I had 9 very happy years at Vilnius University, 1999 to 2008. Well, 9, and then 2 very difficult years after the Holocaust issues started in 2008.
You must have been very brave to move to Lithuania, which was, after independence, was post-Soviet country, and
Yes.
you came from the West. What was the impression when you
Right.
came?
Interesting question. Firstly, there are always personal aspects. I'm an old bachelor. I could never have done this if I had a family. I would have stayed at Yale for sure. And being a bachelor and being the son of my father, I decided to do what the soul wants, what the heart wants. I had been coming from 1990. My first visit, well, I tried to come in the 80s, but I couldn't get a Soviet visa. And in 1990, I came, and my father was, thank God, still alive. And it was a personal trip to visit the towns he had written his 18 books about. That's Švenčionis in Lithuania, and Mechalishki, or today Mechalishki, and Svir, that are in Vilna province, but now just in Belarus. So I came, and I remember a dear friend of mine at Oxford, the late historian, Professor Harry Shukman, he took me to lunch. He says, David, do me a favor, don't go. Why not? I want to see the country where my family lived for 600 years. He says, look, what the Nazis didn't destroy, the Soviets bulldozed over. It will destroy your whole beautiful invention of Yiddish studies at Oxford with its happiness, its youth, its friendship. So I'm very glad Professor Shukman told me that. Of course, as a stubborn Litvak, I decided twice as strongly that I would go. But because of his, what in America they call it lowering of expectations, when I found in Vilnius thousands, certainly hundreds, of amazing elderly Litvaks from all over Lithuania who spoke the different dialects within Lithuanian Yiddish, I decided on a new life academic project. I felt I had more or less done most of what I want to do on the origins of Yiddish, and my new topic would be an atlas of Litvak Yiddish, of Lithuanian Yiddish, and these are, of course, the territories that correspond more or less to parts of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, including today's Lithuania and Latvia, parts of Estonia, all of Belarus, and northern and northeastern Ukraine, what is today northeastern Poland. And I started to come back every 6 months to do expeditions. I had some dear friends, the last Litvaks in Sventsian, and I would stay in the hotel there. It would be my base for these trips to Belarus, to Latvia, with a few friends from Lithuania, with 2 especially. The 3 of us would go for 2 weeks, twice a year, and I would be recording interviews with the people in their 80s and 90s in every part of Lita. Now, my field was Yiddish dialectology, but each of the interviews had the section called Free Speech, where you say, tell the story of your life. So they told me about the Holocaust, about why they are the only Jew left in their town, and many things about the Holocaust, which was a whole education, because let's say after you hear 500 accounts by eyewitnesses, survivors, it's very different than reading the books. So it had a big effect. I wasn't talking about these issues all those years because other people were. And but that's what brought me here, and that was a big part of my decision in '99, my personal decision to come settle here. I understood that these are Mohicans, that most of their children were Sovietized, and they had other languages as first language, and if they knew a little Yiddish, it's for me not interesting, because I am interested in the real McCoy, deep Yiddish. So I would say that's what brought me and kept me here, and at the same time, I came to admire modern Lithuania as a wonderful place, and especially Vilnius. Nobody forces me to live here now at the end of 2018. I love the city. I love my friends. I think that Lithuania has developed into an amazing democracy with humor, with tolerance, and it's a shame sometimes because of some disagreements with one tiny group, people can be painted as against, but that's complete nonsense. It's the whole beauty of friendship and democracy to be able to have discourse, and that's very important now in the whole Litvak-Lithuanian issues.
Before going deeper into Yiddish, can I touch on the Holocaust here, since you mentioned it already? So how do you assess how the Lithuanian government looks at this issue, and especially I know that you criticize this, comparing Soviet genocides, and can you explain more?
Right. The Holocaust in Lithuania was a devastating genocide. 96.4, or let's call it around 96% of the Jewish people in Lithuania were murdered. That's genocide. It's the end of the people as a viable community. Now, this was the plan of the Nazis, and the only people who are guilty are the people who planned it and the people who did it. So, this we have to understand in a very clear context. All these thousands of Jewish people that I interviewed and that I came to know and to love here in Vilnius and all over Lithuania and in Dila, they had absolutely no bitterness or complaint against the Lithuanian people. They understood that even though it was thousands of murderers, it was way under 1% of the Lithuanian population. The whole debate and the bitterness of the debate is over how are we going to regard that less than 1%. Are they criminals or are they heroes? So for the last Litvaks here, it was extraordinarily painful that people like Škirpa or Noreika would have streets named after them, that Ambrazavičius, Brazaitis would have. It was for them that people are celebrating the Holocaust. That if you participated in this Holocaust, you cannot be a hero no matter what else you did. Maybe you're not a villain, but to say that you're a hero means that this genocide is nothing. Now, what does genocide mean? Genocide means that it's different than other crimes. Soviet crimes were horrific. I have been a hater of communism all my life. Stalin was a monster, a butcher of millions of innocent people. Here in Lithuania, there was only one genocide, the genocide of the Jewish population. Thank God the Lithuanian people are here with a wonderful, independent, fantastic country. They suffered terrible things, but not genocide. So the issue is that for a small ultranationalist group, a national narrative was developed that insists on those Holocaust participants, including the LAF, that began to murder thousands of Jews before the first Germans arrived, including the provisional government that signed the papers the Germans wanted, that these can possibly be considered heroes is deeply, deeply painful to those last Holocaust survivors. But to continue the narrative, not only in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Western Ukraine, and other places, a new narrative was developing how to fix the Holocaust. A new theory, there were two equal genocides, and it's not about comparing Soviet to Nazi crimes. Of course everybody can compare. It's about declaring them legally to be equal and passing laws that if I disagree, my opinion is criminalized. So people laugh at me when I say Lithuania is the freest country I have lived in after America and Britain on all questions except this one. About this one, I can give many examples of my Lithuanian colleagues, Evaldas Balčiūnas in Šiauliai, to us Šavo. After his articles on Noreika and Krikštaponas, he suffered years of idiotic cases by prosecutors and lawyers destroying his life. He touched this topic that you're not... Now, if it's a democracy, who cares? You don't like my opinion, answer it. So, anyhow, the double genocide model became a new model into which millions of taxpayers' dollars of this country's hardworking people, dollars, euros, lit, whatever, all of it, were invested to try to convince the rest of the world to change their history. So the high point of this movement came in 2008 with the Prague Declaration that uses the word same 5 times for Nazi and Soviet crimes. For example, it says that all of Europe has to consider Nazi and Soviet crimes the same. It says that the textbooks of all of Europe have to be rewritten so students will be taught the same about Nazi and Soviet crimes. So just think about it. 2008, there were many more elderly last Mohican Litvak Jews alive. What did they think? What were they supposed to think? It's legally now going to be a law that I have to think the same. They know, much as they hate the Soviet Union and Stalinism and are thrilled with Western democracy, they know that from 1941 to 1944, it was only the Soviet Union fighting the Nazis seriously here, the Soviet army with hundreds of thousands of Lithuanian and Jewish and other members, and they know that their families are alive because what happened in 44 and the liberation. So this became an issue. It became an issue for the last Jews here in 2 ways. One, the issue itself. If you guys say that you are also crying over the loss of the Jewish population here, why are you naming streets for some of the perpetrators, and why are you going to Europe to insist that the people who liberated Auschwitz in 1945 are the same by law as the people who committed the genocide at Auschwitz? It's a nonsense. I agree with them. They convinced me, of course, these old people here, but they're absolutely right. Now, it is very interesting that this movement is closely tied to far-right-wing ultranationalist movements throughout this area. That in Eastern Europe, the far right is not like the far right in England or America, where it's skinheads with tattoos yelling nasty things at minorities. Here, the far right are people with doctorates, politicians, academics, journalists, who believe that this double genocide is something important to Lithuanian nationhood. And people like me who love Lithuania all my life, who always has a picture of Vytautas at my front door wherever I live, don't understand it. A country with 1,000 years of amazing heroes doesn't need Noreika and Brazaitis, or even Ramanauskas, I'm sorry to say. And we don't understand it. That's issue number 1. Issue number 2 is, actually 3 issues. Number 2 is the export of this revised history with medals and conferences and prizes and a whole movement to get Western and especially Jewish academics to change their views on what is genocide, what happened. The third thing that happened in many countries, this isn't only Lithuania, is the decline in democracy on this issue. I remember the very first small sign of it came in 2008, I think it was June, the law that forbade Nazi and Soviet symbols equally. Now, my elderly Jewish friends hated the Soviet Union, but they loved the veterans dressing up in their army uniforms with the medals on the 9th of May, and they suddenly felt it's not nice to do that once a year to remember the victory over Hitler. I saw that they were disturbed by this, but it didn't. For me, it was no big thing. In 2008, other things happened that were disturbing, allowing the neo-Nazi marches in the center of Vilnius on Independence Day on March 11th. Then in 2010 came the very disturbing law that criminalizes the trivialization of either Nazi or Soviet genocide. The law was softened after our complaints, our being the community that we call the Defending History community. The law was softened, but let me put it this way. If I say that I think Soviet crimes were horrendous, and I agree we should do much more work to make the West understand the evils of the Soviet Union, of communism, and I agree completely. But in Lithuania, I don't agree that there was a Soviet genocide. I think there was only the genocide of the Jews committed by the Nazis and their allies. Then I am now against the law. I have now just said to you something that criminalizes me. Now, I may not be afraid, but let me assure you that a young graduate student of history will not feel very comfortable looking at this question with an open mind if he or she hopes to stay here and have a career going against also. So what is wrong with government policy on the Holocaust? This is not the whole government. In fact, it was the 8 Lithuanian For Me heroes who in 2012 signed our declaration, led by Vytenis Andriukaitis. They were all Social Democrats, I'll show you in a moment. Now, this declaration, this criminalization, let me get back to that, was part of this trying to diminish the Holocaust by inflating the concept of genocide. Second, making illegal being a dissenter against the views of the government. The third and real, perhaps, issue is the investment in institutions for this purpose. The main institutions are the Genocide Center, and let me give you the name that is right out of George Orwell, the International Commission for the Evaluation of the Crimes of the Nazi and Soviet Occupational Regimes of Lithuania. I think I said it correctly. Now, these institutions, the Genocide Center and the Genocide Museum and the Commission, which was too long a name for the diplomats here, I think it was the Irish ambassador 10 years ago, he gave it a short name, the Red-Brown Commission, because it says everything that's red and brown is equal, so this is how it became known. These institutions are doing a lot of damage to Lithuania. They are destroying the open market of ideas where people could have all kinds of opinions. Instead, they are stigmatizing, vilifying, defaming, trying to destroy the careers and reputations of anybody who disagrees. And the great irony, and for me this is very sad, those 3 institutions, the Red-Brown Commission and the Genocide Center and the Genocide Museum, I could add a certain number of history faculties in the country, they are Soviet informed, completely Soviet informed, issuing official government history with a stamp that this is the truth, and if you disagree, aha, you must be a Putinist agent. This is completely Soviet. This lack of tolerance and this trying to have a... So this is a tiny part of the Lithuanian government. It doesn't reflect on all the wonderful parts of the Lithuanian government. In 2009, I wrote the 2 articles that basically got me fired from Vilnius University, and I was told that they are both in radical leftist publications, and I began to laugh. Wait a minute, what are the 2? Me and radical leftist publications. The first was the Jewish Chronicle in London, and the second was the Irish Times in Dublin. And in my Irish Times article, it was right after the election of President Grybauskaitė. And I said, how wonderful. The Lithuanian people have chosen someone born after the war, an economist. Maybe now there's a hope that this genocide industry that wants to control history and defame those who disagree and is doing so much damage to Lithuania by being seen around the world to be wanting to diminish the Holocaust and to make heroes out of the perpetrators. Nothing could be worse for Lithuania's name. So I think I am giving a much more patriotic view. Lithuania has so many heroes. What is this with Noreika? It is something wrong with those people who are insisting on those heroes. And when a hero, quote unquote, is someone who's participated in genocide in 1941, it's a permanent rift with those who represent the victims, as few as we may be left in the world today.
You talked as if the Jewish life here in Lithuania is over, which basically you are correct, because there are only several thousand of community. So my question would be, how do you see this Jewish diaspora in Eastern Europe? When the Israel of state emerged. Do you think that in the end all Jews will go into Israel, or do you believe that there will be some kind of communities that will keep up living it throughout Europe or United States?
You've asked several questions there. I don't believe that all Jews will ever all move to Israel. Israel is one component of Jewish people around the world. Let me try to answer your question locally first, here in Lithuania. Everything is relative. If we mean a viable community of genuine Litvaks like before the war, of course not. There was a Holocaust and they were all killed. However, I have come to love the local Jewish community small c, the people here, not any of them. These few thousand people are amazing, especially the younger and middle-aged ones who have decided to stay, and even the older ones who have decided to stay. Because I remember in 1990, 91, 92, very many people wanted to leave and left. And because of Israel, or because of Germany, or because of relatives in England, America, wherever, they had where to go. Nobody forced them to stay when Lithuania became free. So this community of a few thousand Jews in Lithuania is, in my opinion, a viable mini community. And we Litvaks always said, small is beautiful. My hope is that there will be some continued interest in the real Litvak culture, Yiddish culture of Lithuania, by some Jews and by Lithuanians. All my years in Vilnius University, my best students were all non-Jewish Lithuanians. So I think that's beautiful to see people studying together the literature, the folklore, the history. So I think my father used to always speak in his poems about an island, that if everything else is lost, let's make a little island where we have our little tiny beautiful culture or language or poetry or study. And that's how I see here the possibility for the future. This has often been clouded by politics, by money, by nonsense, but I still believe in it. There are wonderful international organizations. My favorite one is the Joint, the JDC, Joint Distribution. They help Jewish communities help themselves. And from the 1990s, they were helping initiatives here. Of people to continue with all kinds of... Today I'm a very proud member of the Vilnius Jewish community, led by Simonas Gurevičius, or Shimon Gurevich as we call him, who is still in his 30s and is a wonderful native speaker of Yiddish, which is quite rare for people in their 30s. But it's important symbolically that the leader of our community is a young man who speaks, and I speak only Yiddish to him. Yeah.
What does Israel think about Yiddish language?
Right. Israel and modern Israeli culture was built on a philosophy of Hebraism, of reviving some form of ancient Hebrew into a modern Israeli Hebrew called Ivrit. So this movement, that the Zionist Hebraist movement that created Israel, hated Yiddish. There were terrible laws in the 1920s and 1930s, before independence, that the Hebrew establishment in Tel Aviv enacted. Yiddish writers were beaten up. It was illegal, even after the state was established, to have a daily Yiddish newspaper, until the 1960s. It was Golda Meir who insisted that this is a ridiculous law. But the real thing that happened in Israel was not these terrible laws. It was a campaign to make people hate Yiddish. So from the 30s, 40s, 50s, you had a huge investment in a campaign to tell so many of the majority who were Yiddish speakers, basically that the language you grew up with is an ugly, barbaric dialect or jargon that's only good for those ghetto Jews who were happy to be killed in the Holocaust. You are now a Hebrew, a new ethnicity. So secular Yiddish culture was maintained by a small group of writers, and even today they still have one address in Tel Aviv, but a small, tiny group of writers. The miracle of the Yiddish language in Israel and elsewhere is that now there are hundreds of thousands of speakers from the ultra-Orthodox communities that we can come to later, so they have a strong presence in Israel. Now, Israel is no longer against Yiddish, because Israel succeeded to kill Yiddish in the mainstream decades ago. So after you kill something, oh, it's sentimental, I'll tell you a dirty joke, I'll tell you a song. In other words, many Israeli visitors to Vilnius who come to this room to hear my lectures about Litvaks are amazed when they find out there were over 10,000 Yiddish writers over the last 100 years. They never imagined that this was a sophisticated culture that gave the world a permanent literature. So it's wonderful that Israelis today are rebelling very much, at least conceptually, against what they were brought up with. We all rebel against prejudices that our societies have. It's normal.
Can you tell us how does it feel to talk Yiddish, and also if you can talk several sentences Yiddish and then translate us and just explain how does it feel, to talk Yiddish when it comes to comparing to German or English or other languages? Why does Israel, this barbaric language?
Israel, as I say, no longer has this hang-up about Yiddish. Israel did. Let me tell you, you asked me how I became a Yiddishist, and I completely forgot to tell you what might be the true answer in the Freudian sense. When I was 3 years old, my parents and I went to live in Israel, and we lived for 1 year. And my first memory in life is a few days before my 4th birthday, when my father and I were talking Yiddish on the street in the city he loved in Israel called Sfas, or in modern Hebrew, Tzefat, Safed in English. It is a beautiful Kabbalistic town in the northern Galilee. And a policeman stopped us, and he said to my father in Hebrew, "You are a government Hebrew teacher. You are working in our school. You cannot speak Yiddish on the street." And I remember I began to cry uncontrollably. And then I remember the policeman took us to the police station, and the chief of the local police station knew my father. He came out, he apologized, he said, "I'm so sorry this idiot bothered you." He opened a bottle of wine. It ended very well there, but that night, my father said to me in Yiddish, "Ich David, mir wollen fahren in Amerika." We're going to America. And the next thing I remember is Brooklyn. I have no memory of the boat. So that experience certainly influenced me. So I understood there's a very strong movement against Yiddish among Jews. One, that the state of Israel had that movement. Now that it's been killed, it doesn't anymore. Now nobody cares in Israel if you speak Yiddish. To the contrary, it's interesting, it's a curiosity. But there were other anti-Yiddish movements among Jews. In America, in Canada, in England, in Australia, in South Africa, there was no Hitler, there was no Stalin, but all those Jewish immigrants from Lithuania and Ukraine and Poland and Belarus, they wanted to bring up their kids in the most perfect English, and they didn't. They were worried their kids might grow up with a little trace of a Yiddish accent. I remember this very well. I remember people my age, when we were 9 or 10 years old, boys were looking in the mirror to fix their phonetics, not to have the slightest hint of an accent. That they thought that America's a very monolingual country, as are many of the English-speaking countries. So assimilationism was another very strong anthem. So the secular Yiddishists were very strong in that they continued to write and to publish books till the last day of their lives. But we are talking about people who had to come to some kind of linguistic maturity before 1941. So today, these are people over 90 or something like this, so today there are very, very few. And as I say, they did not, in general, leave a second generation. The miracle of spoken Yiddish that nobody anticipated, it was noticed in the early 1990s that suddenly hundreds of thousands of ultra-Orthodox Jews, Hasidim, are speaking only Yiddish in New York, in Jerusalem, in London, in Antwerp, in Montreal, all over the world, in different places, in Australia. And they are having 10, 15 kids per family. And suddenly, you have fourth, fifth generation people speaking only Yiddish at home. This has led to a lot of introspection that the secular Yiddish movement failed to maintain the language. And about the ultra-Orthodox, most of them are Hasidim, but there's a small percent, 5%, 10%, I don't know, who speak Litvish Yiddish. And the name of Lithuanian Yiddish in the Yiddish language is Litvish. You speak Litvish, which officially means Lithuanian, but it means Lithuanian Yiddish. For example, there is one Hasidic movement in New York, Lubavitch Chabad, and they speak Lithuanian Yiddish because they are Lithuanian Hasidim from the Vitebsk area, and Vitebsk is very deep Lithuania from the Yiddish point of view. Then in Israel, you have some small but resolute groups. For example, the Brisker. They are Litvaks derived from the city of Brisk, which is today Brest in Belarus. They speak Yiddish, Litvish Yiddish. Then in Jerusalem, this is fascinating, you have a huge community of ultra-Orthodox Jews speaking only Litvish Yiddish, including Hasidim who go to live there. And this goes back to the early 19th century when the students of the Vilna Gaon, the Gaon of Vilna, he died in 1797. And in the 10, 15 years after his death, there was a trickle of migration to Jerusalem among his students, and they are called the Alter Yishuv, the old settlement, and they have another name, the Prushim. Prushim are scholars who devote their lives to holy study far away from the noise and trouble of this world. And the Prushim established Litvish Yiddish, and that thrives today in Jerusalem without ever having any language planning or language boards or caring about. They don't care at all about modern Yiddish secular literature. So it's a different subculture of the. And we here in Vilna, I've been very happy to meet many of them who come to visit. Yeah.
When you look at the scientists or other intelligent people and Nobel winners and everything, people see that there are so many Jews, and in particular Ashkenazi Jews, which basically live in Europe and including Eastern Europe. So what is your opinion when it comes to this popular argument that there is some kind of Ashkenazi Jew gene that people tend to be more intelligent?
Right. Well,
is it something to do with history?
Yeah.
Of the people?
Right. Good question. Well, as usual, I'll give you my honest answer. I personally don't believe in more intelligent and less intelligent peoples. Every people has its intelligent people and its wonderful people and its idiots and its terrible people. So for me, it's a kind of racism to say that there's a superior or inferior people. I think that's nonsense and it's been abused by history. What you do have is history driving talent and even family ambitions in a certain direction. Ashkenazic Jews for the last 1,000 years, traditional Ashkenazic Jews, I'm not talking now about the modernists who left the tradition. And before the war, believe me, most Litvaks were traditional religious Ashkenazic Jews. We romanticize the Yiddishists and the Hebraists, the Bundists and the Zionists. They were all very important, but they were a small minority. Most Jews were simple religious Jews. Ashkenazic Jews held the study of Talmud to be the highest thing. They called it the study of Torah. Torah not in the sense of the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, but Torah in the sense of, as you will see, this huge Talmudic literature, the Babylonian Talmud, the Palestinian Talmud, and thousands of years of commentaries on them. So to become a scholar of Torah in that sense became for Ashkenazic Jews the highest ideal, the hero. So the hero was not the gladiator on the horse who would take away the beautiful damsel from another knight and ride off with her after putting a spear in the other guy. No, the hero was someone who wrote a chidush, or chidushim in plural, that means novel, new, original interpretations of some difficult passage that nobody understood before. Now, what does that mean in society? If this is the hero of society, and if you have a rich businessman who has a lot of money, what did this rich businessman want for his daughter as a husband? He wanted a great scholar, not another businessman. So he would often send a shatchin, a traditional matchmaker. It could be from Vilna to Warsaw, it could be from Warsaw to Amsterdam, it could be throughout the Ashkenazic area, to find an amazing scholar, okay, and to bring that scholar home. And that certainly had something to do with it, because there was investment in learning and in education, the value of education. When I was writing my book, Lithuanian Jewish Culture, that appeared here, Baltos Lankos, some years ago, I was studying the 16th and 17th century protocols of the councils of Lithuania, the Jewish council, the autonomous council, and comparing it with the one in Poland. And I found a very big difference. That in many towns in Poland, for example, they would say, if a poor couple is getting married, the town has to find money to give them a nice wedding, the same as for a rich couple. That was in Poland. In Lithuania, never. In Lithuanian towns, I often found it is forbidden for everyone to have a fancy, lavish wedding. Any extra money has to go into bringing a wonderful teacher from wherever to teach in the local school, the cheder and the yeshiva, the local institutions. So I think a big part of the answer to your question lies there. A culture that education is the most important thing, and admiring people successful in their study. And people who study for the love of study are often very good at other things, that firstly in the sciences, but then in the arts too. So that could have a correlation.
You are very much a man of history, but my last question will be about the future.
Yes.
And you can choose the specific angle yourself to answer, but what do you think about the future when it comes to Israel, Jewish nation, Lithuania, European Union, the world, technologies, everything? Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist?
Right. In the short term, I am pessimistic because of all the nonsense going on in the world today and the steps that are occasionally taken backwards. But I am an optimist for the longer term future. I believe that if we want these little islands my poet father spoke about, we can make them. We may not be able to fix the whole world, but we can always create islands. Islands where Litvak Yiddish culture can survive. Islands where all kinds of small languages and culture can survive. On the Jewish question, I see Israel as a very important part, but by no means the whole, because I see a very big difference that is widening between Israelis and Jews, and this is normal. Here you have a strong state, a successful state in the Middle East with a Middle Eastern language, and then you have some few millions of Jews around the world, the most unassimilated of whom are the Ashkenazic, Haredim, ultra-Orthodox who speak Yiddish around the world. So it will be a people of diverse tribes, which I think is fine because I love diversity.
And a small last word in Yiddish for Lithuanian viewers.
Nu, es ist ein Mechaiwes, wir treffen sich, wir seien da, wir kommen zum Tisch, wir reden sich zu Nefet, mit Chaverschaft und mit guten Kavones, wir seien schöne, gute Jahren, wollen kommen noch und sicher zu sein.
I'm afraid you will be the only translator available for
Or
us.
maybe I'll try again in that case. What would be the most appropriate to say? I'm just thinking. It doesn't matter at all. No, sie gewinnen emisse Mechaie, sich zu neufreden mit euch, zu haben dem Schmues, zu teilen sich mit Ideen, mit den Meinungen und zu verstehen, dass wir sitzen alle bei einem Tisch.
And you said?
I said, it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you, to be exchanging opinions, and to be sitting in peace together at one table.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
It was very interesting.
Thank you. A great pleasure. Thank you.